The mockery in Judge Harrison's voice echoed through the packed courtroom as he dismissed the young attorney's objection. "Miss Chen, your amateur understanding of precedent is embarrassing to this court." His words drew snickers from the prosecution table and sympathetic glances from spectators. 28-year-old Sarah Chen stood quietly at the defense table, her simple black suit and worn briefcase marking her as just another overworked public defender. What no one knew was that she had been recording every corrupt decision, every under-the-table deal, every moment of judicial misconduct for the past 15 years. Today, Judge Harrison would learn that underestimating Sarah Chen was the biggest mistake of his career. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories of justice served and hidden truth revealed, consider subscribing for more tales of those who fight in the shadows. Sarah Chen adjusted her glasses and reviewed her notes one final time as the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 247. The Whitmore County Courthouse had been her second home for the past 6 years, ever since she graduated from law school and taken a position with the Public Defender's Office. The building's neoclassical architecture spoke of justice and dignity, ideals that Sarah had watched erode year by year under the current administration. The case before the court today was Marcus Williams, a 22-year-old mechanic charged with armed robbery. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best, built on a foundation of questionable witness testimony and procedural shortcuts that Sarah had seen too many times before. What made this case different was that it represented the culmination of something much larger, something she had been building toward for over a decade. Judge Richard Harrison entered the courtroom with his usual theatrical flair, his black robes billowing as he took his position at the bench. At 63, Harrison commanded respect through intimidation rather than wisdom. His salt-and-pepper beard was perfectly groomed, his posture impeccable, and his reputation for harsh sentences well established throughout the county. What the legal community didn't know was that his decisions often favored those who could afford to influence them. "All rise," called the bailiff, though Harrison had already begun arranging his materials with practiced precision. Sarah stood with the rest of the courtroom, her eyes briefly meeting those of her client. Marcus Williams looked younger than his 22 years, his shoulders hunched with the weight of an accusation that could destroy his future. His family filled the front row behind the defense table, his mother clutching a worn tissue, his younger sister trying to maintain composure, his father staring straight ahead with the stoic expression of a man who had learned not to expect justice from the system. District Attorney Michael Thornton sat at the prosecution table, his expensive suit and confident demeanor marking him as Harrison's preferred attorney. Thornton had built his career on high-profile convictions, many of which Sarah had watched with growing suspicion over the years. The relationship between the judge and prosecutor was too comfortable, too predictable, too consistently favorable to the state regardless of the evidence presented. "Be seated," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying easily through the large courtroom. "We're here for the matter of State versus Williams. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" "The state is ready, Your Honor," Thornton responded, standing briefly to acknowledge the court. Sarah rose from her seat, gathering her worn legal pad and a small digital recorder that she placed discreetly on the table. "Defense is ready, Your Honor." Harrison's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, his expression conveying the familiar mixture of impatience and disdain she had come to expect. "Very well. Mr. Thornton, you may begin with opening statements." For the next 20 minutes, Thornton painted a picture of Marcus Williams as a dangerous criminal who had terrorized an elderly store owner during an armed robbery. His narrative was polished, compelling, and built on carefully selected facts that avoided the contradictions Sarah had identified in the evidence. The prosecutor moved with confidence around the courtroom, his voice rising and falling with practiced drama as he described the trauma inflicted on the victim. When Thornton concluded, Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Miss Chen, your opening statement." Sarah stood, straightening her simple blazer. The courtroom was packed with spectators, media representatives covering what had become a high-profile case. and law students observing from the gallery. She had specifically requested that the proceedings be recorded for the court record, a detail that would prove crucial later. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear but not theatrical. "The prosecution would have you believe that Marcus Williams committed a crime based on the testimony of a single witness who admits to being under the influence of alcohol at the time of the alleged incident. They would have you ignore the fact that Mr. Williams was working at his garage, witnessed by 3 colleagues, during the time this robbery supposedly occurred." She moved deliberately in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as she spoke. "The defense will show you that this case is built on assumptions, not evidence, on prejudice, not proof, and we will demonstrate that the truth is far different from what the prosecution wants you to believe." Judge Harrison interrupted before she could continue. "Miss Chen, I hope you're not planning to waste this court's time with conspiracy theories and unfounded accusations." The comment drew a few chuckles from the prosecution table. Sarah felt the familiar flash of anger that had sustained her through years of similar dismissals, but her expression remained composed. "Your Honor, I intend to present a vigorous defense based on the evidence and the law." "See that you do," Harrison replied curtly, "and try to keep your amateur theatrics to a minimum. This is a court of law, not a television drama." The humiliation was intentional and public, designed to undermine her credibility with the jury before she had even presented her case. Sarah had witnessed Harrison employ this tactic countless times, always against defense attorneys who couldn't fight back, always in cases where a conviction would serve his political interests. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied evenly, returning to the defense table. As the prosecution began calling its witnesses, Sarah methodically took notes, while simultaneously monitoring a small device hidden in her briefcase. The device was connected to a sophisticated recording system that had been documenting courtroom proceedings for years, capturing not just the official record, but also the quiet conversations, the sidebar discussions, and the moments when Harrison thought no one was listening. The state's first witness was Detective Raymond Porter, a 20-year veteran whose testimony Sarah had heard in dozens of cases. Porter's investigation methods were sloppy, his reports often contained discrepancies, and his testimony had a rehearsed quality that suggested coaching. What troubled Sarah most was how frequently Porter's cases appeared before Judge Harrison, and how often those cases resulted in convictions, despite questionable evidence. "Detective Porter," Thornton began, "please describe for the court how you identified Mr. Williams as a suspect in this case." Porter consulted his notes with theatrical precision. "We received a description from the victim, Mrs. Castellanos, within minutes of the robbery. She described a young Hispanic male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Mr. Williams matched that description and was known to frequent the area." Sarah made careful notes, knowing that Porter's report contained several inconsistencies. Mrs. Castellanos had initially described her attacker as much shorter than Marcus Williams, and had admitted to the responding officer that she hadn't been wearing her glasses during the incident. These details had mysteriously disappeared from Porter's final report. "Did you locate any physical evidence linking Mr. Williams to the scene?" Thornton continued. "We found fingerprints on the counter that were consistent with Mr. Williams' prints," Porter testified. Sarah looked up sharply. This was the first time fingerprint evidence had been mentioned in any of the discovery materials. She stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is the first time fingerprint evidence has been presented to the defense. We haven't had an opportunity to examine this evidence or retain our own expert." Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers. Overruled. The defense had adequate time to review all evidence. "Continue, Mr. Thornton." "Your Honor," Sarah persisted, "the discovery materials provided to the defense contained no mention of fingerprint analysis. This is a clear violation of—" "Miss Chen," Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp with irritation, "I've ruled on your objection. Sit down and let the prosecutor continue, or I'll hold you in contempt." The threat hung in the air as Sarah weighed her options. Pushing further would risk a contempt citation that could derail her defense, but allowing fabricated evidence to stand would destroy Marcus Williams' chances for a fair trial. She had documented similar moments in dozens of cases, building a pattern of judicial misconduct that went far beyond simple bias. Your Honour, I respectfully request a brief recess to consult with my client about this new evidence. Harrison's expression darkened. Request denied. You'll have to work with what you have, just like every other public defender who comes into my courtroom unprepared. The insult drew a few snickers from the gallery, and Sarah felt the familiar burn of injustice that had driven her for years. She remained standing, her voice steady despite the provocation. Your Honour, due process requires that the defence have adequate opportunity to examine all evidence presented by the state. This is a fundamental right that... Miss Chen, Harrison's voice cut through her words like a blade. Your amateur understanding of due process is embarrassing to this court. Sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah remained standing, her hands steady on the defence table. In that moment, she felt the weight of every case she had lost to corruption, every client who had been railroaded by a system that served politics over justice, every young attorney who had been intimidated into silence by judges like Harrison. Your Honour, she said quietly, I am attempting to provide effective counsel to my client as required by law. What you're attempting, Harrison replied, his voice dripping with condescension, is to grandstand for the media. This is precisely the kind of amateur behaviour I've come to expect from overworked public defenders who think they can make a name for themselves by challenging established procedures. He turned to the jury with a theatrical sigh. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologise for this disruption. Unfortunately, inexperienced attorneys sometimes forget that courtrooms have rules and procedures that must be followed. The humiliation was complete and public, designed not just to undermine Sarah's current case, but to establish her as an ineffective advocate in the eyes of future juries. Sarah had watched Harrison employ this tactic for years, systematically destroying the credibility of any defense attorney who dared to challenge his authority. She sat down slowly, her expression unchanged, but her mind racing through the documentation she had been building for over a decade. Every insult, every procedural violation, every moment of bias had been carefully recorded and catalogued. Today would be different because today she was finally ready to use it. As Detective Porter continued his testimony, Sarah noticed Thornton glance toward the judge's bench with a slight smile. The exchange was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had been watching for years. Harrison nodded almost imperceptibly, a signal that Porter could continue with his fabricated evidence without fear of interruption. The fingerprint testimony continued for another 10 minutes, with Porter describing analysis procedures that Sarah knew had never been performed. When Thornton finally finished his direct examination, Sarah stood for cross-examination, her legal pad filled with notes that would expose every lie Porter had told. Detective Porter, she began, you testified that fingerprints found at the scene were consistent with my client's prints. When was this analysis performed? Porter consulted his notes again. The prints were lifted on the day of the incident and analysed within 48 hours. And which laboratory performed this analysis? The County Crime Lab. Sarah made a note, knowing that the County Crime Lab had been closed for renovations during the period Porter claimed the analysis was performed. Who specifically performed the fingerprint comparison? That would be... Porter shuffled through his papers. Technician Martinez. Detective Porter, are you aware that Technician Martinez was on medical leave during the period you claim this analysis was performed? Thornton jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honour. Counsel is arguing facts not in evidence. Sustained, Harrison ruled without hesitation. Miss Chen, confine your questions to matters within this witness's direct knowledge. Sarah felt the familiar frustration of watching evidence suppressed, but she continued methodically. Detective Porter, do you have the original fingerprint analysis report? It would be in the case file. I'm asking if you have it with you today. Porter looked toward Thornton, who shrugged unhelpfully. No, not with me. Did you personally witness the fingerprint analysis being performed? No, but Did you personally compare my client's fingerprints to those allegedly found at the scene? No, that's not my area of expertise. Sarah paused, allowing the admission to sink in with the jury. So your testimony about fingerprint evidence is based entirely on a report you don't have with you, performed by a technician you can't identify, at a laboratory that may or may not have been operational at the time. Objection. Thornton was on his feet again. Argumentative. Sustained, Harrison ruled. Miss Chen, ask proper questions or sit down. But Sarah had made her point with the jury, and she could see several jurors taking notes with renewed interest. She continued her cross-examination for another 20 minutes, systematically exposing the weaknesses in Porter's investigation while building a record of the procedural violations she was documenting. When the morning session ended, Sarah found herself alone in the courthouse library, reviewing her notes while preparing for the afternoon. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Careful, counselor. Some fights aren't worth winning." Sarah deleted the message without responding. She had received similar warnings over the years, usually before cases that threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about the local justice system. What the senders didn't know was that she had been preparing for this moment for 15 years, building a case that went far beyond any single trial. The afternoon session brought more of the same. Testimony from witnesses whose stories had changed multiple times, evidence that appeared and disappeared from reports, and procedural rulings that consistently favored the prosecution. Judge Harrison's bias became more pronounced as the day wore on, his interruptions of Sarah's objections growing more theatrical and dismissive. During a brief recess, Sarah overheard Thornton speaking quietly to Harrison near the bench. She couldn't make out all the words, but she caught enough to understand they were discussing the evening's plans. Something about dinner reservations and a mutual friend who would be joining them. The casual friendship between judge and prosecutor was another piece of the corruption puzzle Sarah had been assembling. When court reconvened, Harrison called for sidebar conference with both attorneys. Sarah approached the bench, her digital recorder carefully positioned to capture their conversation. "Miss Chen," Harrison said in a low voice, "I'm growing tired of your disruptions. This case should have been resolved with a plea agreement weeks ago." "Your Honor, my client is innocent. The evidence doesn't support the charges." Harrison's expression hardened. "The evidence supports whatever I determine it supports. If you continue to waste this court's time with frivolous objections and amateur theatrics, I'll make sure every judge in this district knows exactly what kind of attorney you are." The threat was clear and illegal, an attempt to intimidate a defense attorney into abandoning her client's rights. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, knowing that this conversation was being recorded and would become crucial evidence in her larger case. "Your Honor, I'm simply trying to provide effective counsel to my client." "What you're trying to do," Thornton interjected, "is create grounds for appeal by manufacturing judicial bias where none exists." Sarah looked between the two men, seeing the comfortable collusion that had defined their relationship for years. "I'm documenting the proceedings as required by law." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Step back, counselor." As they returned to their positions, Sarah noticed several spectators in the gallery watching her with intense interest. One man in particular, wearing a simple grey suit and sitting alone in the back row, had been taking notes throughout the proceedings. When their eyes met briefly, he nodded almost imperceptibly before returning to his observation. The state rested its case late in the afternoon, having presented testimony that Sarah knew was largely fabricated. When Harrison asked if the defense was ready to proceed, Sarah stood with her closing argument prepared. "Your Honor, the defense moves for a directed verdict of acquittal. The state has failed to present credible evidence that my client committed the alleged crime." Harrison barely looked up from his papers. "Motion denied. Present your case, Miss Chen, and try to keep it brief. This court has a busy schedule." Sarah spent the next 2 hours calling witnesses who testified to Marcus Williams's whereabouts during the time of the robbery. His co-workers confirmed he had been at the garage, his time card showed he had clocked in and out normally, and security footage from a nearby business showed his car in the garage parking lot throughout the relevant period. Judge Harrison interrupted repeatedly, sustaining objections from Thornton that had no legal basis and limiting Sarah's ability to present exculpatory evidence. By the end of the day, it was clear that Harrison had already decided the outcome of the trial, regardless of the evidence presented. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah remained at the defense table, organizing her materials and preparing for what she knew would be the most important day of her career. Tomorrow, she would present her closing argument. But more importantly, tomorrow she would finally reveal the evidence she had been building for 15 years. Her phone buzzed again with another anonymous text. Last chance to walk away. Sarah turned off her phone and gathered her materials. She had been building toward this moment since she was 13 years old, since the day she had watched Judge Harrison sentence her older brother to prison on fabricated drug charges. Tomorrow, she would finally get justice for Carlos, for Marcus Williams, and for every defendant who had been railroaded by a corrupt system. As she walked through the empty courthouse, her footsteps echoing in the marble corridors, Sarah felt the weight of the evidence she carried. Hidden in her briefcase were 15 years of recordings, photographs, financial records, and documentation that would expose a network of corruption reaching from the courthouse to the state capitol. Tomorrow, Judge Richard Harrison would learn that some fights were worth everything. The final day of the trial dawned grey and overcast, with storm clouds gathering over Whitmore County. Sarah Chen arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, carrying 2 briefcases instead of her normal one. The additional case contained materials she had hoped never to use, evidence that would destroy careers and possibly her own future in law practice. As she entered courtroom 247, Sarah noticed the gallery was more crowded than it had been on previous days. In addition to the usual spectators and media representatives, several individuals she didn't recognize occupied seats throughout the room. The man in the grey suit from the previous day was back, joined by 2 women in conservative business attire who seemed to be studying everyone who entered the courtroom. Judge Harrison entered promptly at 9 o'clock, his demeanor confident as he prepared for what he clearly expected to be a routine conclusion to the trial. District Attorney Thornton sat at the prosecution table, reviewing his closing argument notes with the satisfied expression of someone who knew the outcome was predetermined. "Good morning," Harrison said, settling into his chair. "Are we ready to proceed with closing arguments?" "The state is ready, Your Honor," Thornton replied. Sarah stood slowly, her hand resting on the second briefcase. "Defense is ready, Your Honor, but I have a preliminary matter to address before closing arguments." Harrison's expression immediately soured. "Miss Chen, we've wasted enough time on your preliminary matters. Present your closing argument or rest your case." "Your Honor, I believe the court needs to address a significant issue that has come to light during this trial." "The only issue that needs addressing," Harrison replied sharply, "is your continued disruption of these proceedings. Sit down and present your closing argument." Sarah remained standing, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Your Honor, I need to present evidence of judicial misconduct that has directly affected this case and dozens of others over the past 15 years. The courtroom fell silent. Thornton looked up sharply from his notes, his expression shifting from confidence to concern. Harrison's face flushed red as he pointed his gavel at Sarah. "Miss Chen, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, arrest this attorney immediately." But Sarah was already opening her second briefcase, removing a thick folder and a small digital device. "Your Honor, before you hold me in contempt, you might want to hear what I have to say." "Bailiff," Harrison's voice carried across the courtroom, "remove this woman immediately." The bailiff, a career court officer named Rodriguez, hesitated. He had worked in the courthouse for 20 years and had seen his share of corruption, but he had never witnessed an attorney openly challenge a judge with such confidence. Instead of moving towards Sarah, he stepped back slightly, his hand resting on his radio but not activating it. Sarah activated the digital device, and Judge Harrison's voice filled the courtroom, crystal clear and unmistakably his own. "The evidence supports whatever I determine it supports. If you continue to waste this court's time with frivolous objections and amateur theatrics, I'll make sure every judge in this district knows exactly what kind of attorney you are." The recording continued with Thornton's voice. "What you're trying to do is create grounds for appeal by manufacturing judicial bias where none exists." Gasps rippled through the gallery as the implications became clear. Harrison had been recorded threatening a defense attorney for doing her job, and the prosecutor had been complicit in the intimidation. "Turn that off!" Harrison shouted, his composure completely shattered. "Bailiff, arrest her for contempt." But Sarah was already playing the next recording, this one from 3 years earlier, featuring Harrison and Thornton discussing a case over dinner. "The Martinez kid needs to go down hard. His family's been causing problems for the county development project. Make sure the drug charges stick." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Several spectators stood to get a better view of the proceedings, while others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. The media representatives in the gallery frantically scribbled notes and made quiet phone calls. Harrison slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order. Order in this court." Sarah opened her folder and began distributing copies of documents to the court reporter, the prosecution table, and several individuals in the gallery. "Your Honor, I am presenting evidence of systematic corruption that includes bribery, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to deny defendants their constitutional rights." The documents contained financial records showing regular payments from Thornton's private account to a shell company controlled by Harrison's wife. Bank statements revealed deposits that coincided with major case decisions. Hotel receipts and restaurant bills documented meetings between the judge and prosecutor that violated judicial ethics rules. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos, "I have recordings of 47 separate conversations over the past 15 years in which you and Mr. Thornton discussed case outcomes before evidence was presented. I have documentation of evidence that was suppressed, witnesses who were intimidated, and defendants who were railroaded through this court system." Thornton was on his feet, his face ashen. "Your Honor, this is clearly a setup designed to disrupt these proceedings. I move for an immediate mistrial and sanctions against counsel." But Harrison seemed unable to respond, staring at the documents in front of him as if they might disappear if he looked hard enough. The financial records were damning, showing a pattern of payments that could only be explained as corruption. Sarah played another recording, this one featuring Harrison's voice from 5 years earlier. "The public defenders are getting too aggressive. We need to send a message that this is my courtroom, and I decide who wins and who loses." The man in the grey suit stood up from the back of the courtroom, producing a badge and identification. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Special Agent Michael Torres with the FBI Public Corruption Unit. This courtroom is now under federal investigation." 2 more agents emerged from different areas of the gallery, their movements coordinated and professional. They had been documenting the proceedings, gathering evidence for what was clearly a long-planned operation. Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is entrapment. This is a setup." Sarah turned to face him directly, her voice calm but carrying the weight of 15 years of preparation. "Your Honor, this is justice. Every conversation, every corrupt decision, every time you denied a defendant their constitutional rights has been documented. Today, the system finally holds you accountable." She reached into a briefcase one final time, removing a photograph that she placed on the defense table where everyone could see it. The image showed a young Hispanic man in handcuffs, his face bearing a striking resemblance to Sarah's features. 15 years ago, Judge Harrison, you sentenced my brother Carlos Chen to 8 years in prison on fabricated drug charges. He died in prison 3 years into his sentence, killed by inmates who had been told he was a snitch by guards who were following your orders. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about Marcus Williams or judicial corruption in general. This was personal, a 15-year quest for justice that had required Sarah to become a lawyer, to build cases patiently, and to wait for the perfect moment to expose the truth. Carlos was 17 years old, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. He had never been arrested before. The drugs found in his backpack were planted by Officer Morrison, who was taking orders from Detective Porter, who was following instructions from District Attorney Thornton, who was carrying out your plan to clear Hispanic families from the neighborhood to make way for a development project you had financial interests in. Harrison tried to stand, but his legs seemed unable to support him. This is impossible. You can't have... I can, and I have, Sarah replied. Every corrupt decision, every innocent person you railroaded, every family you destroyed has been documented. Today it ends. Agent Torres approached the bench, his credentials prominently displayed. Judge Harrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, civil rights violations, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda warning echoed through the courtroom, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she had carried for 15 years. The plan had worked exactly as she had envisioned it, from her decision to become a lawyer through her years of careful documentation to this moment of final revelation. Marcus Williams, who had sat silently through the chaos, finally spoke up. "Miss Chen, does this mean I'm free?" Sarah turned to her client, allowing herself the first genuine smile she had felt in years. "Yes, Marcus, the charges will be dismissed. You're going home to your family." As federal agents led Judge Harrison and District Attorney Thornton from the courtroom in handcuffs, Sarah began packing her materials. The case that had started as a simple armed robbery trial had become the catalyst for exposing 15 years of systematic corruption. The man in the grey suit approached her table, extending his hand. "Miss Chen, I'm Agent Torres. We've been building a parallel investigation for the past 3 years. Your evidence is exactly what we needed to make our case airtight." Sarah shook his hand, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. "How long have you known who I was?" Torres smiled slightly. "We've known about your documentation efforts for about 18 months. When this case was assigned to Harrison's court, we realized it might be the opportunity we'd been waiting for. And you let me proceed without warning me? We needed the corruption to be exposed in open court, with witnesses and media present. Your approach was perfect. You've just brought down a network that reaches into the State Attorney General's office." Sarah absorbed this information, understanding that her quest for justice had been part of something much larger. What happens now? Now you testify before a federal grand jury, and now the real work begins of cleaning up this district's justice system. As the courtroom finally emptied, Sarah stood alone at the defense table, looking up at the empty judge's bench where Harrison had dispensed his corrupt version of justice for so many years. Her phone buzzed with a text message, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was from Marcus Williams' mother. "Thank you for giving us our son back." Sarah Chen, the quiet public defender who had been dismissed as an amateur, had just brought down one of the most corrupt judicial systems in the state. But more importantly, she had finally gotten justice for her brother Carlos and every other victim of Harrison's court. The storm clouds that had gathered that morning finally opened, sending rain against the courthouse windows as Sarah walked out into a world where justice, for once, had prevailed. The new courtroom was identical to the old one in its physical layout, but the atmosphere was completely different. Judge Maria Santos, Harrison's replacement, ran her court with fairness and respect for all attorneys, regardless of their experience or resources. Sarah Chen sat at the same defense table where she had exposed the corruption, but today she was there for a different reason. "The court recognizes the outstanding service of Attorney Sarah Chen," Judge Santos announced to the packed gallery. "Miss Chen's courage in exposing judicial corruption has led to the conviction of 14 officials and the overturning of over 200 wrongful convictions." The ceremony was supposed to honor Sarah's work, but she found herself thinking about Carlos, about Marcus Williams, and about all the defendants who would now receive fair trials in this courtroom. The real victory wasn't the award or recognition, but the knowledge that justice would finally be possible in Whitmore County. Agent Torres, now a friend, approached her after the ceremony. "The Attorney General wants to offer you a position heading up the state's new Judicial Integrity Unit." Sarah considered the offer, After months of testimony and investigation, she was ready for a new challenge. "I'll think about it." "Take your time," Torres replied. "But don't take too long. There are a lot of other courtrooms that could use someone like you." As Sarah left the courthouse that day, she passed a memorial plaque that had been installed in the lobby. It read simply, "In memory of those who suffered injustice, and in honor of those who fight for truth." She had never asked for recognition, never sought publicity for her crusade. All she had wanted was justice for her brother and accountability for those who had corrupted the system. Now finally, she had both. The work would continue in other courts, other jurisdictions, other places where power had corrupted justice. But for today, in this courthouse, the system worked the way it was supposed to. And that was enough. Sarah Chen walked out into the sunlight, ready for whatever fight came next, knowing that sometimes the most important victories came from those the system had underestimated. The quiet public defender had become something more, a guardian of justice, a defender of the innocent, and proof that one person, with patience and purpose, could change the world. The case was closed, but the mission continued.